Right, well, welcome. So this is the third in a series of lunchtime seminars on the Active Living Census, with a focus today on physical activity and recreation. So I acknowledge that Macedon Ranges Shire is on Dja Dja Wurrung, Taungurung and Wurundjeri countries, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be here today. So welcome. As I mentioned, this is the third in a series of seminars about the Active Living Census, with the focus today on physical activity and recreation. So looking at who meets the guidelines of physical activity, who wants to be more active, and also some of the barriers to being more active. We'll look at the most popular ways to be physically active and also use of public open space. Very brief bit of background as to the Active Living Census. So a regional survey on health and wellbeing with a focus on recreational activity. And it was conducted across the whole of Campaspe region. So that involves 6 local government areas, including Macedon Ranges Shire. And it was distributed to all households in those 6 local government areas, distributed by post in May 2019. And sent out with a letter that also encouraged people to complete the survey online if possible. So all in all, we received just under 25,000 surveys across the region and just over 3,500 survey responses for Macedon Ranges Shire. And that means with those kind of, that volume of responses, we can really cut the data in some interesting ways to consider not only how physical activity and recreation differs across LGAs, but also within Macedon Ranges Shire, within our towns and districts, and for people of different characteristics as well. So a really powerful data set that we have for the first time. So a very quick reminder of the questions that were included in the Active Living Census. The ones that I've put in bold there are the ones that we'll focus on in today's presentation. So looking at physical activity, as I mentioned in the intro, use of public open spaces, PARs, recreation activities, improvements and barriers. The second session in the series really looked in depth at those health and wellbeing indicators. So you might be interested in going back and having a look at those. And you can see as well, we asked a range of demographic questions. And when I talk about cutting the data in different ways, what I mean is we can use those different demographic indicators to consider whether physical activity differs for people who were born in Australia versus overseas, or for males versus females, and really start to unpack who might be missing out in participation, and also how their barriers differ as well. So there's some of the things that we'll look at today. So first of all, just a very brief reminder that guidelines for physical activity differ across the lifespan, and that that sort of affects, I guess, the way we're looking at the data. I can hear someone's just joined in. If you wouldn't mind just putting yourself on mute just to cut out that background sound, that'd be great. Thank you. This slide here, we're looking at how much of the day people are spending, how much of the week people are spending being physically active. So minutes across the week. And you can see that there's a real decline over the lifespan. So it starts off, sort of around 300 minutes a week and really decreases as people are aging. So I think what's particularly interesting here is that there are differences between males and females of all age groups, but that for females there's a real sharp decline in adolescence. So our young females are doing much less physical activity than male peers of the same age. So for females, that decline in physical activity starts much earlier on, and I think that's a really important group that we can be targeting. So looking now at converting these minutes of physical activity to meeting the guidelines. So in particular for our adults, it's not just meeting the 150 to 300 minutes of moderate activity, or half that if it's vigorous, but it's also doing the muscle strengthening activities on at least 2 days per week. We can see a similar picture for Macedon Ranges Shire compared with the region. where 62% of adults within our shire are meeting the guidelines for physical activity. I think it's good to see that only, just under 3% would be considered sedentary. And that's slightly less than what we see for the region. But certainly where we can really do more work is this 35.5% who are just not quite doing enough to meet the guidelines. So as shown in the last slide, Macedon Ranges, we're actually sort of among there's a greater proportion of people meeting the physical activity guidelines in our shire compared to some other areas of the region. So those arrows indicate where there's a statistically significant difference. So with any of these numbers that I present, there's a little bit of fuzziness either side of that percentage. But where there is an arrow, it means we can say with confidence that that difference that you see between the bars is not just due to chance. Well, there's a 99% probability it's not due to chance. So they're the ones we really want to focus on. So here we can see that within our shire, that there's more people meeting the physical activity guidelines in Macedon Woodend than there is in Romsey. You'll start to see this pattern recurring a little bit through the slides. So here it's probably indicating, a bit of a pattern of higher physical activity in our more affluent areas of the shire, and that's certainly a pattern we see across the state and across the country. So looking now at meeting physical activity guidelines for men and women of different ages, and also according to other personal characteristics. So you can see, looking at males and females of different age groups, that there's sort of a greater difference, a bigger gap between young males compared to older males, whereas for females it's kind of similar as they're aging. There's not any statistically significant decreases in meeting those guidelines. But similar to what we see with the minutes per week, there is that pattern of a decline into older age. What I think is most interesting here is we start to see some real patterns with fewer people meeting guidelines who have poor mental health or poor physical health. So roughly 3 in 5 of all adults are meeting the guidelines, but it drops to 2 in 5 among people who have low life satisfaction, poor mental well-being, and also around 2 in 5 for poor self-rated health. So people who say their health is fair or poor when they're asked to categorise it. We can also see that only just over a third of people who need help with daily activities meet the guidelines. And there's also a significantly lower proportion of people who identify as LGBTQIA+ who meet the guidelines as well. So, this starts to suggest that there are factors in people's personal lives and circumstances that are really influencing their ability to participate and to be physically active. So the top line report also considers a whole lot of clustering with other health behaviours as well. And perhaps of no surprise to anyone that people with low physical activity are also less likely to meet dietary guidelines. So guidelines for fruit and veg consumption, and also associated with higher sugary drink consumption. And I think that's a really useful take home for people who work in a program space, particularly if you're delivering programs that focus on perhaps diet, that you could expand that to also consider physical activity or connecting people in with those other complementary supportive programs. All right, so this is kind of the flip side of the coin, where we say, well, okay, for those who are not meeting the guidelines, would you like to be more physically active? And we see that 53% of adults within our shire were not as physically active as they like, so they want to be more active. That similar proportion across the whole region. When we look within our shire, though, we kind of start to see the reverse patterning. So those people who were less likely to meet the guidelines are more likely to want to be physically active. And that certainly starts to play out when we look at the characteristics of people who want to. So really high appetite for greater physical activity among people in their middle age. So you can see they're significantly higher among people who are 35 to 49 for both males and females, really peaks around that time of life. But we also see that sort of opposite pattern that, we know that people with poor mental health and poor physical health are less likely to meet the guidelines, but the vast majority really want to be more active. And I think this is really encouraging for us who are looking at changing those patterns, that this is a space that people want more opportunities to participate in and perhaps want to have a conversation about as well. I think it's also interesting here that people in those other vulnerable groups, so those who are food insecure or financially insecure, also really keen to be more physically active. So there may be other barriers within their life, within their personal or social circumstances that are causing hardship and challenge, but this is something that they would like to change. Similarly, we see that reverse pattern where those with a poor diet do want to be more active. So this is where it starts to get quite interesting, I think, where we consider the barriers to being more active. And not shown on this slide, but the number one barrier to not being more active, I guess, is being time poor. So that's the top reason that people say that they're not as active as they like. But those reasons for not being as active as people would like really differ across the lifespan. And you can see that reflected in the size of the different coloured bubbles there. So for kids, they're really influenced, I guess, by their parents because they're really reliant on a parent or a guardian to facilitate and support their exercise. We see being time poor is also the number one factor for kids, as it is for adults in general. But you also see safety as being important. So 16% of people say that that's the top barrier for kids. And there's certainly something we can do about that in terms of opportunities like active transport. How do we make those opportunities for kids to be active, more safe and supported? When we go into adolescence, you can see that different barriers start to emerge. So for our young people, cost starts to be a factor for 30%, as does a lack of social support, a lack of transport. So it's really difficult for our young people as they're wanting to be more independent, but don't necessarily have their own independent transport options. And I guess are really influenced by that peer support as well. When we look at older adults, their top barriers really are poor health or disability that's limiting them from participating in physical activity to the same extent. And I guess that's where we consider, ways to encourage participation regardless of those limitations. So supporting people to be active in their day-to-day environment and also through group exercise that takes into account those individual challenges. This is a very busy slide. I just want to point out a couple of things and drawing on from that notion that the barriers to being more active really differ depending on your personal circumstances. So again, we see that although being time poor is the number one barrier across the Shire, for some of those people with different personal vulnerabilities, whether that be financial insecurity or poor health or poor mental health, it's not really time that's the number one barrier. There are other things that are going on in their lives. We see factors like cost being very important for people with those financial vulnerabilities. We see lack of transport really emerging strongly, particularly for people who need help with daily activities. They're really reliant on that support to access opportunities to be active. We see lack of social support being more of an issue for females than males, but also people with poor health and poor mental health are really identifying a lack of social support as being an important barrier for them in being more active as well. Poor health or disability, unsurprisingly, is significantly more of an issue for people with poor physical health or poor mental health, also people who need help with daily activities, and interestingly also people who experience food insecurity. So I guess this sort of starts to flag some of the problems that individuals might be experiencing, which I think can really help us to target programs and interventions for people who we know are less physically active, and to really think about what some of those barriers might be. I think there's certainly more that we can do to understand those barriers for people with these characteristics and to really start to design solutions as well that help to incorporate physical activity into people's day-to-day lives. Looking here at people's requests for improvements to the physical environment, to our public open space that would encourage them to get more active. Again, probably unsurprising that walking tracks and footpaths, number one. So far and above, many more people identified this as a really important thing for them to get more active. So identified by 36% of people as something that would benefit them. So that's followed by exercise equipment and facilities. That includes sporting fields, so it includes the kind of bigger facilities like the Macedon Ranges sporting precinct shown here, as well as the smaller ones like outdoor gyms. That was sort of on par with bicycle tracks and lanes, which strangely has been paired with skate facilities. I think the skate facilities only contributed about 1% to that total. So that's really just showing a strong indication for greater bicycle infrastructure. And coming in fourth there, toilets and change rooms. So these amenities are also really important to help people to participate. Certainly in some recent consultation we did for a Healthy Heart of Victoria project called Walk Kyneton, identified that particularly for our older adults, that having access to toilets was a really important factor to giving them the confidence to get out and about on walking trails or in public open spaces. And similarly, having gender neutral and accessible change rooms are really important to enable people of all genders, ages and abilities to participate in some of those more organised sporting activities as well. This is just an illustration of all of the different activities that we showed to people in the census. So people could nominate up to 4 of these different activities and then really expand on how many times a week they did them, where they did them, how they got there, how far they travelled, and also the quality of the facilities that they used. So I won't go into depth about sort of breaking down the facilities, the distance, quality, but all of that information is there in the top line report if that's of interest. What we will do is have a little look at the most popular activities from that list. So walking comes in as number 1. And again, we start to see this real theme emerging where walking is popular for people of all ages and abilities. And it's also, comes in as our top infrastructure request as well, more paths, better connected paths, and new paths as well. I would suspect that actually the proportion of people who are walking for exercise is even higher than 21%. But it's possible that, in amongst this big list of 60 different activities, it might have been those more organised sports and activities that were sort of top of mind. Nonetheless, walking still a clear number 1, followed by swimming. And swimming was the top activity for our kids. I'll show you a little bit more on that on the next slide. Bushwalking comes in as number 3. And certainly Macedon Ranges Shire was the only shire that sort of had bushwalking within those top 3 activities, most popular activities. And that's followed by fitness and gym, active play and cycling, jogging and running, indoor group fitness and AFL. I think what's useful to bear in mind here is these are the most popular activities for all residents, but that preferences differ depending on age and gender. So, for example, we identified earlier that adolescent females do spend less of their week doing physical activity. For adolescent females, their most popular activities are walking, netball and swimming. So here, netball emerges as a popular sport. It didn't make it into those top 9 activities. However, it's something that's of real popularity among that group that we want to encourage to be more active. I think though, the other side of this coin is thinking about, are there other things that our adolescent females might want to be doing, but they're not because the infrastructure is not there? For example, I'm just hypothesising here. So for males, AFL is the number one activity for that age group, that 12 to 17 group. Is it that females of a similar age group would be interested in giving that a go if they had those changing spaces and perhaps clubs that they can participate in? So on one hand, this information I think is really useful to identify current trends. However, we can also kind of pair it with some of those barriers and really understand what opportunities people of different ages and genders would like in order to be more active. All right, moving now into use of some of our public open spaces. So we can see here that across Loddon and Campaspe, use of public open space is pretty popular. So in the bars there, the darker it is, the more frequent the use is. So from sort of a weekly use in the darkest colour up to a less frequent use in the paler colour. And then what's missing is those who are not using those spaces at all. So the vast majority of our residents are really using our public open space. They're really popular spaces to go to for passive recreation and active recreation as well. And we can see here that those public open spaces even there's a greater proportion of people accessing them in Macedon Ranges than in Campaspe, Central Goldfields, Loddon. However, there are differences in who's accessing those spaces according to where they live. So we can see here Landsfield, Romsey, slightly less people accessing our public open space. And that's where we start to see these patterns of our perhaps less populated areas or more rural areas. Fewer people perhaps have those opportunities to access good public open space. We see a similar pattern with footpath use, where Landsfield, Romsey, residents from those areas, those districts, significantly lower proportion are accessing footpaths than what we see in our more populated areas, Gisborne, Kyneton, Gisborne and Kyneton, where there are better, more connected footpaths that really, you can take to access places of interest, your schools, your shops, that sort of active transport and incidental activity that we know is really important to contributing to overall physical activity as well. Off-road walking and cycling tracks, again, more people in Macedon Ranges Shire accessing these trails and tracks than what we see in Loddon and some other areas in the region. And similarly, we see, again, some differences across the Shire, where, again, fewer people in Landsfield and Romsey accessing these off-road walking and cycling tracks than we see in our more populous, more affluent areas. So thinking about what infrastructure is available to people in our less populated and more rural areas, more rural districts, I think is really key there. So I think it's really important, if you've been in one of these presentations before, I always include this slide. And it's just really a reminder that, the Active Living Census gives us some really valuable and rich data about people's individual experiences. And we can sort of start to consider that at a community level, where we consider how people's experiences differ according to their characteristics, so their gender, any limitations they might have, any support they might need in their day-to-day activities. But that exists within a society, and it's really important that we create, supportive environments for people to be active, both the social environment, but also the built environment. So making sure that we have, that we're planning for infrastructure that supports people to engage in, to participate in active ways of walking, cycling, as well as our sports, those more organised sporting activities. So we have sped through all of those different areas there. Who's meeting the guidelines, who wants to be more active, our most popular activities and use of public open space. I'm just going to summarise some key findings, and then I think it'd be really valuable to hear any feedback on how this fits in with your own experiences, or I guess some ideas as well on where to from here. So, time spent being active, we can see that it decreases with age. and that males of all age groups spend more time exercising than females of the same age. We also see that that gender gap is greatest in adolescence. We can see from the results that 3 in 5 adults meet guidelines for physical activity, and that those guidelines show a pattern with more affluent areas of our shire. So more people in Macedon Wood End meet guidelines for physical activity than in Romsey. And we can also see some patterns with other determinants of health. So we can see that people who need assistance with daily activities, and people with poor health and poor mental health, less likely to meet those physical activity guidelines. But they really want to be more active. People with those characteristics face different challenges to being more active. So those barriers, those challenges really, they change depending on people's age, depending on where they live, and also on their life circumstances. And I think understanding and unpacking those challenges is really key to supporting more people to be more active. It's a bit of a no-brainer that more and better walking trails and tracks, most requested improvement to our public open space, and also the most popular way to exercise for people of all ages and genders. So that's a really great way that we can increase physical activity by investing in opportunities for more walking and cycling as well. We can see from the data that preferred activities, preferred ways to be active, differ by gender and across the lifespan. Most people use our public open spaces, paths and trails, which is excellent. It's really important that we continue to invest in and develop these spaces, particularly in those areas that are potentially a bit more rural. So in Romsey and Lancefield, the less populated areas of the Shire. More information on facility ratings and quality, if you're interested in that or interested in participation in a particular sport, you can find that in the top line report. So the first one to the left there is the top line report, which has really detailed tables, both on the top 20 most popular physical activities. So we've just looked at the top 9 there today, but we actually go up to the 20 most popular activities. So you can see who participates in those and all of those facility and quality ratings. The selected findings reports have not only a breakdown for physical activity by gender and by some key age groups, so for kids, adolescents and older adults, but there's also a page differences by gender and for people who need assistance with daily activities, so there's key population groups, and also differences across districts in the Shire and our top 10 sports, participation in those. So really, that's a really great first stop for some sort of user-friendly information that I hope will also be useful for community groups, clubs, and other groups who might want to be applying for grants and funding.